Nietzsche, A Genealogy of Morality. Enjoy, buy, serve, worship, admire, produce, become, serve, repent, withhold.
To evoke again that postmodern space to which the text of Nietzsche leads us and try to move us a bit beyond that, because the secret of a postmodern society is that everything that was directly lived has moved away into a representation or an image. This hermeneutic of suspicion that Nietzsche is drawing out is that Christianity, while presenting itself as a religion of love and compassion and tenderness, is a mask of hate and fear and another form of power.
Friedrich Nietzsche, the infamous philosopher's anti-philosophy philosopher, a critic and undeniably one of the most important thinkers that emerged from German idealism. In many ways, arguably the most important in the sense of being an active antithesis to emerging modernity. For philosophy at large, Nietzsche seems to be the one name seemingly recognized everywhere, yet never really seems to be understood by many public admirers, like, at all.
And of course the rights that you have, natural rights, are logical consequence of your transcendent value. And that's nested in, this is Nietzsche's observation.
Yet for many others, because of his far proximity away from modernist thought, which in many respects modernist we are, it's completely understandable and okay to be confused by Nietzsche. Considering Nietzsche's entire project directly uproots much of the iterative process that is philosophy, there is a ton of historical baggage to understand regarding his larger project going forward. With Nietzsche, there is a discrete teleology that moves throughout his time. The beginning of this process comes from the birth of tragedy, which we've done a video on, link above, through several various texts, all the way to right here, to the time of Beyond Good and Evil and the Genealogy of Morals. There is a reason I am jumping from the birth of tragedy to here, and that is that I think this is where Nietzsche is at his most Nietzschean, and as the title states, where we can see the glimmers of a postmodern philosophy that's emerging, where undeniably the critiques levied of philosophy and modernity emerge in newer, radically different thinkers seen in the 20th century. Ultimately, what I hope to do here is show Nietzsche in a relational sense with larger philosophy and further context of his actual project, not most of the isolated stuff you see from the internet. The kind of edgelord, the alpha, the actual individual freethinker in a world filled with NPCs, which, of course, I am not. The UBERMENSCH, the adolescent teenage wet dreams that get associated with him. We're keeping this video light, and again, trying to add context to Nietzsche from the 21st century, contemporary culture, and theory today. Nietzsche starts with the most noble thing a philosopher could do, which is absolutely destroying the British, namely the British psychologist of his time, around the mid to late 19th century psychologist, who claimed to truly understand the origin of morality, that being a process of virtuous, selfless, human behavior that was applauded and ethically instilled by communities. Because we all know the British are the bastion of morality across the globe, right? Anyways, Nietzsche rejects this theory of morality outright, not necessarily because virtuous, selfless behavior, sacrifice, isn't desirable per se or admirable, but because it's rooted in its time and what is subjectively useful, not what is epistemically or even metaphysically true and good, in a truly natural sense. Thus, it's historically dependent, not universally true. Nietzsche calls these psychologists ahistorical, not understanding the social fabric that determines what is useful. In my mind, this is where Nietzsche becomes interesting, and primarily useful in a current context, by asking the question, where the does morality actually come from? Human ingenuity? People themselves? Atomistic individuals just consciously deciding they like something in isolation? No, it's these guys. What's usually lost with Nietzsche is the bits of a class analysis intertwined. Weirdly coincidental that many academic Nietzscheans left those parts out. Oh well, The social bounds of our world, and the priests who uphold them, decide for us, determine our conscience. Nietzsche finds that we are tied to our positions within society and the socially instilled moral fabric around us. Now it is plain to me, first of all, that in this theory, the source of the concept good has been sought and established in the wrong place. The judgment good did not originate with those to whom goodness was shown. Rather, it was the good themselves, that is to say, the noble, powerful, high-stationed, and high-minded, who felt and established themselves in their actions as good, that is, of the first rank, in contradistinction to all the low-minded, common, and plebeian. There is an intrinsic social hierarchical flow of morality to Nietzsche, as he designates morality as a form of oppressive prejudice, inklings of the false consciousness and theory of ideology seen within Marx. The idea that society's ideology, ways of constructing our worldviews, is directly tied to the ideals and functions of the ruling class. Here, Nietzsche immediately posits these moral systems to what he thought were, in his words, stupid racisms and harmful, warlike demagoguery that came from rulers and aristocracy. And, in typical Nietzschean fashion, an aristocracy he simultaneously celebrates and denigrates at the same time. He gives the examples of prejudice originating from conquest, from the supposedly superior Vikings, the Visigoths, and the Huns, people who conquered Europe and populations with darker complexion, societies where war was seen as virtuous, and, in his current age of modernity, European colonialization of the world. But he, of course, finds this to be nonsense from an objective, universal case. These things aren't intrinsically good, and especially nowadays, we really don't think they are good. It was the chaotic happenings of history, of men who were only concerned with morality as it pertained to use, not a universal truth revealed to us by God, or reason, and rationale. Nietzsche sees this genealogy, the beginning of morality, rooted in use case, a use case that is subjectively historical, all depending on the time of its use, not something universally true in its entirety. In the same light as morality, Nietzsche has a bone to pick with truth, the constant progress philosophers are obsessed with, and to Nietzsche, in the most naive way. What then is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which have been enhanced, transposed, and embellished poetically and rhetorically, and which after long use seem firm, canonical, and obligatory to a people. Truths are illusions about which one has forgotten that this is what they are. Metaphors, which are worn out and without sensuous power. Coins which have lost their pictures and now matter only as metal, no longer as coins. And here we see the beginnings of the dreaded postmodernism. Yes, all the postmodern neo-Marxists are here to celebrate. You know, the actual Marxists who often dislike Nietzsche and postmodernist. But I digress. Irrelevant. Truth is gone. God is dead. It's all good here on YouTube. So we will continue. To Nietzsche, it is here that the beginnings of Christianity flipped the prior historical active good, the society seen during the time of Greece and Rome, where the body, activity, movement, conquering were seen as the designations of a moral good, to a new historical world where Christianity designated a quiet good that necessitated an ascetic relinquishing of sinful ways of life in the past. We will get to this asceticism in Christianity later. We now move to ressentiment, to slave morality, which, to Nietzsche, presents the psychological conditions of his present. The conditions that pre-modern Christianity, and the closely tied present state of modernity, has brought upon Earth and its inhabitants. Nietzsche now sees a world where language, the ethos of emancipation, is that of resentment and slave morality, for it comes from a hate of an aristocracy, of life, rather than an actual progressive vision of emancipation, from a place of passive lack of power. rather than active facilitation and work towards the future, where, in Nietzsche's mind, at least an aristocracy, or the Vikings, weren't quote-unquote mediocre like all these current, modern, powerless plebeians. To put it simply, Nietzsche saw the common man and their misguided moral system founded on resentment, with an aristocracy that valued what he claimed was active, forgetful, in a positive sense, never caught up in resentment, genuinely happy without the need to convince themselves of said happiness via the priest. I find this separation and dichotomy a bit vulgarly short-sighted by Nietzsche, I'll admit. I mean, we've never heard of genuinely unhappy aristocrats throughout history, have we? I know he's speaking of values, not necessarily humans, but I can't imagine Nietzsche doesn't tie those values to their historical human counterparts. We'll get to some potential shortcomings I find interesting in this. I digress though. Nietzsche does seem to synthesize an aristocratic value tied with the priest. It absolutely isn't all rose-tinted glasses upon an aristocracy. He even uses a cult of the physical to describe knights, talks about the anti-Semitic hate from other resentful aristocrats, and so on and so forth. But Nietzsche's concept of slave morality often lies with the exact Nietzschean philosophy that facilitates the far-right wet dream of Nietzsche, even if it's very shallow and incomplete. Yet I think there's a massive problem with Nietzsche's slave morality, even within a Nietzschean approach, within his own logic. Hear me out here, I think this is an important part of Nietzsche's philosophy that tends to get overlooked. Nietzsche is an incredibly passionate, flamboyant writer in a way that I really do appreciate. There is no dry language with him, and what I love about his writing is that, at least, I think, he conveys his actual internal attitude, feeling, better than most. Because it isn't dry, I find his emotional disposition towards what he is writing about to be much more upfront than most. This is important though. I find this very resentiment, very present in Nietzsche's writing on slave morality. I think there is a reason Nietzsche has a bit more of a favorable view of aristocratic values, and finds the beginnings of moral good to begin with this resentment. Nietzsche was a man of ill health for a large part of his life, had certain social and romantic problems, and never even married. If there's one thing that Nietzsche is right about resentment in general, it is its ability to externalize personal shame, or a lack of agency onto the other, namely certain vulnerable groups, minority races, LGBTQ+ people, and in the case of Nietzsche, on the common plebeian man. There's a common debate regarding Nietzsche on whether he is a reactionary thinker, and on the plane of slave morality, I find if there's anything to this, it's probably here. But any reactionary thinker, one who seeks to keep a social project the same for the sake of it, who claims slave morality as a reason to oppressively bend social relations against people and life, ironically miss his very point, and like a South Park episode, Nietzsche is also here to f*** you up too.
What? It's a foxtrot, Mr. President! Oh, thank God for the whites.
Nietzsche, given his postmodern character, is extremely difficult to pin down on a modern scale. Reactionary, non-reactionary, right-wing, left-wing. For many postmodern thinkers, these things don't necessarily apply in the same way. Alright, so enough on the discussion around Nietzsche's ideological person. None of this slave or aristocratic modes of morality, of resentment, a beginning of morality, is useful if we don't also get into the various effects and psychological conditions Nietzsche homed in on. Nietzsche brings up the dreaded condition of bad conscience, a natural state of guilt that the common person feels. Guilt by way of sinning, by a lack of being able to keep up with production, by not reeling in the things that make you feel human. Nietzsche states that this bad conscience has been rooted in a function of debt reprisal, a debt you must fulfill, a promise, whether to a god, to yourself, to your boss. But here's something that I quite like that Nietzsche employs. He claims this very guilty foundation is a cause for the creditor and debtor system on a material economic level. To Nietzsche, everything has a price in modernity. The most sublime forms of human cooperation and community are now abstracted into financial and material shackles. Again, convenient, this part of Nietzschean philosophy is often left out. Kind of weird, huh? Seems kind of important to me, personally.
Then certainly one of the big stories of the mid to late 20th century would be the incredible increase in the switch from technologies which concentrate on increasing the intensity and the power of manual labor to those which tend to replace mental, intellectual labor.
I am not considering $50,000 debt reduction.
This very sense of guilt is the driver, the mesh of modernity, not necessarily physical force or punishment itself. Our entire subjectivity, personhood, is wrapped up in this. Celebrations happen when you complete a set of demanded objectives, say graduation parties. Guilt happens when you simply don't. But even then, guilt can be deemed too much. Here is exactly where Nietzsche informs generations of later philosophy to come. This guilt is directly tied to punishment. Festivals, public executions that would burn in the concept of keeping said promise or else. Promise to not break the law. The promise to go to church. To simply keep in line. Even if the history of punishment is for itself completely benign of actual meaning, we celebrate this punishment to see this very quote-unquote justice happen. It's to actually keep this guilt to the forefront of our unconscious functioning. This unconscious part is important. Today, it is impossible to say for certain why people are really punished. All concepts in which an entire process is semiotically concentrated elude definition. Only that which has no history is definable. Of all things Nietzsche has said, this is among the more profound in my mind. Right here, Nietzsche creates the bedrock for later philosophy. People like Michel Foucault, all the way to actual Marxian humanist thinkers in the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. It's almost as if you could say they are
a postmodern, radical, neo-Marxist.
Sorry, I had to. That's a joke. Don't take that seriously. Whether it be through the lens of structuralism, through critical theory, through understanding punishment and constraint through a contemporary post-structural lens, Nietzsche was a significant bedrock. Modern society to Nietzsche didn't really cure the brutality scene in pre-modern society, of war, of looting, pillaging. It just relinquished this brutality to spectacle, to contracts and legal proceedings. It changed the form in which it exists. Violence, subversion in modern societies is hidden, and only when there's pushback to a certain order of things does it actually seem violent. Not only this, the very contracts, the legal bounds, rules is presupposed into our system, one that indicates guilt before the very act. You are guilty by definition itself. If you are, in Nietzsche's words, the legal subject in modern society, and society itself is built upon this very guilt, even the process of justice is meant to make sure that this guilt doesn't escape you. Thus, there is no real, legal, judicial system that is neutral. Nietzsche explains this here. The criminal deserves punishment because he could have acted differently, is, in fact, an extremely late and subtle form of human judgment and inference. Whoever transposes it to the beginning is guilty of a crude misunderstanding of the psychology of more primitive mankind. What Nietzsche is saying here is that we mistake the modern man for being able to neutrally determine a just outcome. But not only this, it's systemic. It's here that an entire system of punishment, justice, fair trials are never really fair. It's based upon the discretion of other citizens with the same will to justice. See what I did there? There is no fair trial. There is no fair proceedings in the realm of justice itself. There's an ideal here, an ethic that marks modern society, that being an ascetic ideal, asceticism on a moral plane. All of this so far, Abrahamic religion, abstract, contractual, liberal modernity, can be rooted in a baseline ideal of cynical asceticism. Relinquish your desire for the multiplicities of life, for good, for productivity, your boss, your family, friends, and even community. To Nietzsche, there stands an inherent negation of life itself, a negative subtracted from the world around you. And here is where I require your attention. This part is especially important. Important because people like to say or imply a lot of dumb shit about Nietzsche that isn't entirely correct. I know you all know the popular Nietzsche thing, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. This single quote, as moving and insightful as it is in actual context, is just bastardized everywhere. Maybe you have seen Jordan Peterson cry about it. Maybe it's used in some weird political talk show about how America is full of gay people or something, about the downfall of Christianity and Western civilization. Yeah, you know, the two things Nietzsche arguably despised most, right? The saying God is dead had cathartic implications to Nietzsche. He absolutely was concerned about a new humanity past the ascetic, moralistic constraints seen within Christian society. The unknown isn't less scary to Nietzsche than anyone else, especially when you are as critical as him. But Nietzsche contains within his phrases, words, a multiplicity of meanings. The priest he talks about aren't always technically priest, and when he says God is dead, it isn't necessarily just a bad thing. There's anxiety there for sure. But as he sees it, there's a new potential for a world past the same types of religious asceticism that denies our ability to live with some type of agency. I don't know. I think Matt McManus from the Pill Pod puts it well.
I just want to add to this by saying that I'm now picturing like George Bataille or Michel Foucault in the middle of like some hardcore BDSM and like just ramming every kind of thing into every conceivable orifice, like covered in like bodily fluids, and like their fucking like person is like, is it right? And they're like, doesn't matter. God is dead. Okay, there's no right or wrong. Just give in to your animal impulse.
But there's a joyfulness to it, right? Like that's why the gay science, right? Like the joyful science. I mean, there's like a joyfulness to unleashing. We can let go of this now, and we can just be ourselves.
Yeah,
Thank
we can have all
God.
the kinky BDSM we want,
There's
right?
a relief.
And with Nietzsche and multiple meanings to things, Matt has now discovered a brand new meaning to the gay science. You know, the book where the God is dead thing was written. Thanks, Matt. This third essay in the book, What is the Meaning of Ascetic Ideals, has a ton of niche commentary around Richard Wagner, mainly Nietzsche's disappointment about Richard Wagner's supposed close relationship with asceticism later in his career, stuff like that. And the comparison between Richard Wagner and Schopenhauer and all that stuff doesn't matter. I'm really trying to focus on the main things Nietzsche is concerned with on an actual philosophical level. The very psychological and sociological constraints from modernity and Christianity. And in the case of the genealogy of morals, the beginnings, the use case, and the trajectory of morality, and the types of moralism that do exist. How history shapes the social bounds of psyche, the relativism of our experiences. Nietzsche is messy, in my mind, a bit overrated in isolation, but ironically because of these imperfections, his chaotic playfulness, his arrogance, his insecurities, all laid out in writing. I appreciate him only more because of this. There's a reason people who've clearly never read Nietzsche try to use him to affirm their own beliefs, their own meaning. Which, of course, I would never do. Instead, I just grift and make these videos for Patreon money. Seriously though, big thanks to everyone who helps out on Patreon and the YouTube members section. I really couldn't do this without you guys. It's the only way I could make these, and you all go above and beyond. Speaking of going above and beyond, these specific people went above and beyond the above and beyond. I wanted to thank Valerian, Stacy Solano, Ogle, and Kate. Massive extra special thank you to you guys. I'm hoping this video wasn't too goofy, wanted to do something a bit different here, and Nietzsche was the excuse. I, again, can't really take him that seriously, it's just Nietzsche. Hopefully, though, I'll see you guys again soon.